All right, so wireless is probably, in some ways, this is going to be, I think, the most useful chapter in some ways. We're so used to wireless now for all of our communications that in a lot of cases we forget about wired and some other things, but they all work together. But we think about wireless when we think about things like our cell phones or our tablets or our laptops. And the thought of having to plug in a cable in some cases sounds particularly horrible. So we want to talk about some of these pieces. And again, we have some terminology. So wireless LANs. How do we get a signal through some kind of radio frequency? In other words, we don't want to have a physical connection. So some of these are similar to what we've learned, and then you're going to see some differences and some of the limitations. It's not as though we can just keep adding pieces and adding pieces. We've made some significant strides, but there's some physical limitations. And I will say up front that I don't think we will ever reach the point where a wireless network is as good as a wired network from either a security standpoint or the standpoint of stability, throughput. You don't have, and we'll show you why some of those are. So layer 3 and above protocols, both of them. Part of it, what we have to do is think about this in terms of the wireless spectrum. In other words, those wireless beams that you're seeing have a spectrum of frequency. In other words, how many times they cycle up and down in a second. And so this chart kind of gives you a couple of this idea. So down here we have RFID tags kind of on the lower end, AM radio slotted in there, shortwave, near field communications, FM. So when you see 100.7 on the FM dial, that's what we're talking about, 100 megahertz. Cellular data is buried in there, more cellular pieces, and then appears Wi-Fi, and then we have these other bands. There's a limited number of them. That spectrum is the only one we have. That's it. They're tightly regulated, and Wi-Fi takes up a fairly small portion. So we also have TV in there. All these other things that you want to have wireless all have to happen in that physical band. It's limited. How much space do we have? So, in fact, if you notice here at the 5 gigahertz, there's another piece for Wi-Fi. So there's a couple of spaces, but it's very limited. And you're going to see that, hopefully. You're going to see how limited we are. So we use more than just Wi-Fi, though. So there are a couple of other technologies we need to look at. So Bluetooth is one we use a lot. Bluetooth is typically a short distance, 30, 40, 50 feet at most. But it's very handy. We can hook up things like printers. We can hook our phone to our headphones because all of the major manufacturers decided we no longer need headphone jacks. So now we have to hook up to some kind of a wireless connection. In your car, it's pretty handy. I throw my phone in the car, and I can actually put up my podcasts and things directly on there. So there's really two different types. So there's frequency hopping spread spectrum and direct sequence spread spectrum. Ugh, those are a mouthful to talk about, but different types of communications uses different types of standards. It's part of the reason why one is shorter range than others. Some are less ability to send data. So some of them you may not have heard. So Zigbee. So in the live class, I'm going to guess nobody in here has heard the term Zigbee unless you read the book ahead of time. So if you have not, Zigbee is a low power, so that means a battery can last a long time, but very low data. So it's perfect for some uses. So a use like a tire monitoring system on a car, where it's got to have a battery in that car and that tire the whole time. So those kinds of things where it's not a lot of data, but it's low battery usage is kind of one of the keys. So there's one called ANT Plus that we're going to see. Uses a fixed frequency. So Wi-Fi is direct sequence spread. So you're going to see part of that, and we'll talk about how that works. So generically, we have two, we call them transceivers is another term you'll see, because they both transmit and receive. So your network equipment here, so here we have a receiver, here we have a broadcasting. So when it's sending out a signal, it's broadcasting. When it's receiving, it's a receiver. So we can do a hop from building to building. So for example, if we wanted to make a hop from this building to the admin building with a wireless communications, we could do that. We could set an antenna on top of each building. We could create a Wi-Fi link. We actually did a couple years ago from the science building, the Hoyt building, the top of the Hoyt building, and we sent a link all the way to Hamburg, Iowa. We were able to make a link. So you can get some distance to some of this, but there's a couple of keys. So one of those is you have to have these antennas have to be tuned to the right frequency. You have to have the right equipment to have in place. To do that, we also need to talk about that pattern. And we call it radiation, but it's not a radiation that's going to hurt you. But it's how does it send out that signal? Is it omnidirectional? In other words, it goes in all 360 degrees, vertical, horizontal, everywhere. So that's omnidirectional. If we focus it, a unidirectional or a focused antenna, so you've probably seen microwave horns on some of these antennas on towers around. That's focusing it in a single direction, or as close as you can. So, omnidirectional everywhere, unidirectional or a targeted antenna or a directional antenna focuses it in actually one or two directions and tries to make a longer connection. So, omnidirectionals are great when we have them out here in a hallway, spreads everywhere. But if I want to make a long connection from here to Hamburg, I've got to use a directional. In other words, not only are they on the same frequency, but they're actually tuned to each other and aligned. The term range is really how far we can get with our signal and how far is it usable. And those are two different things. I can often see a signal, but it's not strong enough to be usable. So we have to be aware of those two. Lots of terminology this chapter. So we use the term line of sight. So typically the signals we're going to send are what we call line of sight. In other words, they have a direct line from the transmitter to the receiver or from my phone to the Wi-Fi antenna. Line of sight tends to be the thing we look at with Wi-Fi signals the most. And you're thinking, but I have a Wi-Fi signal and I'm not line of sight. Even though I know it's out in the hallway, it's not a direct line of sight. So one of the things that can happen is these signals can go through something. So, in other words, I can pass through a wall. And I will say walls like this that are built out of brick and concrete and very thick don't pass a signal through them very well. You can be absorbed. So in that case, it hits this wall and gets absorbed. But what it really does is it can actually, though, reflect around. And we'll talk about those refractions. So there's a lot of other things that can happen to that signal. And as we've seen that, we start taking advantage of some of these refractions to do that. So our signal can fade. In other words, we get too far away. We've all had that. We're driving down the road, listening to our favorite radio station, and it starts to lose that signal. We've gotten too far away. That signal is too weak. Well, the same thing with Wi-Fi or any of our wireless protocols. We get too far away, we lose that signal, and no longer can we connect with it. So that fading we can also look at as the idea of attenuation. In other words, that signal gets weaker. Well, there's a couple of ways we can fix that, something like on our campus. I can turn up how much signal is dumped out of those access points. That gets me a little greater distance, at least where I can see it. The problem is, can my phone also turn up its power like that? Probably not. And so as we lose that signal, we have to come up with some other solutions. And one of those is we have to repeat it or have additional access points. So we have, just like we do on that fiber, we have to have repeaters. Well, on our campus, we have hundreds of access points to do that. Now, those access points are all then trunked into our main network. So we end up with a couple of issues with Wi-Fi or any wireless signal. Further away we go, it gets weaker. Okay. And wireless signals, if we have any kind of electronic noise, EMI, somebody with a ham radio, something, you can get taken out pretty easily. They're subjective to a lot more interference because we don't have anything surrounding it. There's not a hollow tube between you and that Wi-Fi button. So we have a term in here, and you may have heard it in other things, called signal to noise ratio. In other words, what is the ratio of noise to the strength of the signal? So sometimes we talk about it, if you're on discussion boards and things, that the signal to noise ratio is low. In other words, there's a lot of people making comments off to the side versus the original message. Well, it's the same idea. In wireless, I want to send a really good signal, have communications, and noise on there presents a problem. So if my signal to noise ratio is low, that means I'm going to have a lot of repeated transmissions, I'm going to have a lot of dropped packets, and I'm going to have a very slow, very unreliable connection. So noisy environmental areas can be an issue. So areas with motors running. So you can try this at some place that's got a lot of motors running. And one I've noticed fairly frequently is car washes. If you go park beside a car wash, especially a bigger one, they'll have a lot of motors running. Look at your cell phone signal even will start to drop there. If you try to hook onto a Wi-Fi network, you may see that. So as those motors create a lot of EMI, and so that's a place we see those a lot. So we have some other terms about how this signal is going to get changed as it encounters things in the environment. And we can refract it. So in other words, it goes through towards something and it alters how fast it goes. Glass is a great example of that. Glass refracts that Wi-Fi signal and you think, oh, it came through all right. A good example of refraction and how something can change is get a glass of water and a straw. And if you put the straw in it and you look down at it from the side, that straw looks like it takes a bend when it hits the water. That's refracting. Because the light goes through that water differently than it does air, it looks slightly different. And so as our signal comes through different materials, it may change how it appears. Reflection then, something that bounces back. So if I have an all-metal building, that signal may hit the outside and bounce back and not even enter. Or it may scatter it. So in other words, I had a metal building and it's got that wrinkly tin on it. It hits that and scatters everywhere, that electronic signal. We may also have something called diffraction. So diffraction is like that light beam when it hits that prism and you see it scatter into its different components. So if you've done that in a physics class, that's a very similar thing. So this might show some of those items here a little easier on a picture. So scattering, in other words, hits something and reflects. So here we've got our access point, and it's got all these things trying to interfere with you getting to the next room. Well, now we've gotten a little better with some of the technology. We say, you know what, we can take this scattering and this reflection and all these, and we can use them to our advantage. So we know that signal will bounce its way around. So here it's going to bounce through the door and eventually get here. And we can take that in advantage. So maybe we can lose that line of sight just a little bit as long as that signal can penetrate the walls. problem is if it's too delayed, in other words, it bounces around too many times, then we're going to end up with signal delays or we're going to drop packets. The best connection we can have is line of sight, and shorter the better. And every one of these vendors that sells you access points or routers for your house and says, oh my goodness, this one will do 1,700 megabits per second, are lying to you. And they're lying to you because if you actually see the test results of how they do that, they have them setting literally 6 inches apart to get that speed. And as soon as you move past that 6-inch foot mark, those speeds that you're going to send and receive data are going to drop. And we're going to look at some other ways they lie to you. So we've got Wi-Fi, we've got Zigbee, and then some other people came along and said, oh man, we've got to have some of our own standards. And one of them that's come about is the idea of IoT. And IoT has a lot of different standards depending on vendors. So I really like a company called Wyze, W-Y-Z-E. They make some really inexpensive cameras. So for $20, you can have a Wi-Fi camera setting on your home network. For $40, I think it is, you can have one that will tilt and pan and move around. They have some outdoor cameras. They've got a lot of stuff. They've even got sensor kits for your doors. Well, the sensor kits in some of these now, they use their own network. They created their own little standards. So it's not, I can't go buy a HomeLink system and connect it to the Wyze system. So they use some non-standard pieces. Well, other companies have done the same thing. And so in IoT, if we look at it, and not just your house and Alexa, but if we look industrial and we look commercial, there's 40 billion different standards out there, and you end up being stuck with one manufacturer. There are some standards coming out that hopefully will address that. And I think in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have some interoperability. But right now, it's kind of a crapshoot. If you buy from one company, you're going to end up kind of stuck with them. So, personal monitoring devices. So, what am I talking about? Well, all of us are running around with Apple Watches, Fitbits, all these different kinds of ideas. We're monitoring our personal networks around us. So we may have Alexa connected to our scale, for example. That would be a really bad idea if it yelled through the house what your weight was every morning. No, bad idea. But there's a lot of those that they're putting those all together. Smart homes. So we can put locks and door things. And I will say it's kind of nice. I can lock my doors remotely. Great. I can have security cameras. Great. I know who's on the front porch of my house. But that interoperability seems to be an issue. And we have yet to come up with some really great standards on those. So lighting. Again, I really like Wyze because they had some cheap light bulbs that were all controllable. So you can put in controllable lighting at a little cheaper cost and some of those things. So you can do some really neat things. You have to realize, is this compatible with whatever I happen to have as my brand for today? So one of them, while we're talking about Wyze, that I think is really cool, I don't remember, I paid $300 and something for the Apple Watch, and it checks my heart rate and does a couple of things. Wyze, actually, if you go to their site, it's kind of an interesting site to look at. It's kind of on the forefront. So they actually have a personal monitoring system similar to a Fitbit. Color screen, at least as good as my Apple Watch, $25. So it's kind of interesting how technology and times change. So wireless, so if we call it a WPAN, so wireless personal area network. So we talked about personal area networks. WPAN is another way to look at it. Usually it's Bluetooth or Zigbee. There's some other technologies, some proprietary ones. So typically they're very short range. So printers are a great use for that. When you come in the house, your printer's got Bluetooth, you can print from your phone. That's kind of handy. And we looked at other ways your Bluetooth can connect. Bluetooth is actually how your watch, if you have an Apple Watch, and your phone connect. So Zigbee. Zigbee is a standard that came out, and it's very low powered. So in other words, a battery will last a long time. So the places I see it a lot, things like tire monitoring devices. Your water at your house may have a little transceiver outside that will transmit that, so nobody has to actually physically read it. So that's a place. Medical sensors, a lot of times, are Zigbee. So some of the heart monitors and those, so it's not a huge amount of data, but that battery can last for a long time. So door locks may be Zigbee, and I've seen that. So when you do card swipes, that may be Zigbee. You may have Zigbee receivers in some of your trucks or equipment so you can see where it's at physically. So Z-Wave is one that came out. And Z-Wave's still around. And some of your smart home devices, they require a hub. So you buy a Z-Wave hub, and there's several different companies that produce them. And so that hub sits in your house, kind of like another wireless receiver, and the devices then connect to it. So my door locks, maybe my thermostat, my sensor that says, hey, my basement is flooding. Those kinds of things all work through Z-Wave. So Z-Wave can run about 100 meters wirelessly, and at the frequency it runs, one of the cool things is it can penetrate most walls. So Zigbee or Z-Wave can actually do a lot of your house. Even if you have a little bigger house, you can put in a repeater and catch most of a house. So Z-Wave is a really great idea. You're going to see it in home automation. So there are even some appliances that are Z-Wave compatible. So you can get a dishwasher that will report back on your Z-Wave network. You can also get one now that's Wi-Fi, and you can turn on your Wi-Fi to do it. So Bluetooth is probably the most common one you guys see. Everybody has a phone with Bluetooth. We have Bluetooth hanging out all over the place. Bluetooth is on my watch. Bluetooth is on my ear sets, my headsets, microphones. So Bluetooth says, all right, I'm pretty decent. One of the things that it does is it is able to change frequencies. In other words, once I'm paired with another device, it can say, hey, I need to change frequency. This one's getting noisy, and I can hop around a little bit. For a lot of things, it's really great. There's a couple of problems with it. Some of it happens from security issues. So Bluetooth was designed before we really thought about security. And now some of those ideas are ingrained in it, and it's hard to get back to where we should be. So if you think about when you hooked up your Bluetooth in your car, and it said, oh, you've got a security code so that you can pair them. And security code is only 4 digits. And usually set to things like 12340000. Ah, crap. That leads to a couple of problems with it. So Bluejacking is not as bad as what it seems. You will see this now at malls and other shopping places. If your Bluetooth is on and it can discover it and your phone doesn't block it, you may get an ad on your phone saying, hey, I see you just walked by the Victoria's Secret store. We've got a coupon for you. So Bluejacking means they're sending data to you. And you think, well, I don't go to Victoria's Secret that often. I hope not, Chris. It's not an you were looking uncomfortable. So I used it as an example. But I think, and I could be wrong, but you can find it other places. And one of them I've seen that seems to be a Bluetooth is actually at Casey's. And the Casey's Reward uses Bluetooth to actually send you coupons when you get near the store. So similar type of thing. Now, at least in case of Casey's, I've approved it. Bluejacking tends to mean you haven't approved it. It's unsolicited. They just send stuff to you. Bluesnarfing, though, is a little more problematic. Bluesnarfing means I'm actually getting information from you without your permission. And Bluesnarfing because that Bluetooth has a really tough hold in your phone on a lot of devices. In other words, I can get to almost any piece of information. In theory, by using some technology and blue snoofing, we can actually get all the stuff off your phone. That includes your texts, pictures, phone contacts. Oh. Well, it's okay, because we're only a short distance, right? We're at most about 30 feet. But there have been some hacking attempts, and it almost looks like you're holding a rocket launcher, and they probably have built them that way. But you're using a very tuned antenna, and they've been able to pull data off phones from 200 feet plus, off Bluetooth. So here's what I'm going to say about Bluetooth. If you don't need it, turn it off. Most of your phones, it's pretty easy to do. It'll do two things. One, you're not going to get unwanted data or send unwanted data. And two, it'll save you some battery life. Because I love my iPhone 11, and it seems to do better than any phone I've had. It still doesn't make it till midnight before the darn thing dies. So it'll save a little bit of battery. So there are different levels of Bluetooth in terms of how much power it distributes. So there are some that are much longer range, but the amount of power it takes to send that would kill your phone pretty quickly. So you don't see them on that very often. Occasionally we'll see them. So it's now since past its prime, but when we first built this lab, we had a wireless mouse and a wireless keyboard that were Bluetooth, but a class 1, and we could in theory take that keyboard and walk all the way out of the side of the building and still use it. We spent a fortune for that keyboard, and it didn't work worth a darn. So, such is life. But again, that was in 2011. Things are improved a lot now in terms of some of that signal holding. Ant is something that was developed by Garmin. Garmin. I've heard that name. And before every phone had its own GPS, you got a Garmin, was one of the biggest brands for GPS. They are still a big brand in things like GPS systems for tractors and industrial systems. So this is a protocol. It operates on about the same frequency as Wi-Fi. And it's used a lot in things like medical and other areas, some commercial activity areas. So you don't see it as much on your personal side, but now it's more of a commercial entity that's kind of taken that over. But things like your John Deere tractors use Ant. So if you have the tractor that's got every individual seed ability to adjust the seed rate as it goes, or those are using a technology like that. So some of the new combines will actually tell you where in the head feed is coming, if there's blockages, all those kinds of things. A lot of times those use that. And then we have our friend RFID. Here's where it gets a little ugly and sometimes controversial. So RFID has a tag. And those RFID tags aren't very big. So if you have a credit card that's got a chip on it, that's a form of RFID. Most RFID is passive. So in other words, it has to have a signal excited. So it vibrates when it gets a frequency at the right response, and it will vibrate enough to send out a signal and say, hey, this is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's serial number. Why that's important is it's gotten a bad rap. RFID tags are small enough you can put them in things like pets. So they're about the size of a grain of rice when you put them inside of a dog or a cat, and you can use that wand and you can pull its number. It doesn't store a lot of information about Fluffy. It really only has enough data to store that serial number. But we see on movies that people, oh my God, they put a chip in the back of my head. Or we see a lot of this talk right now with COVID and testing that, you know, they're using that swab and they're actually putting a sensor in your brain. No, not so much. But most RFID, and especially the ones the size of that grain of rice, are passive. You have to have some way to activate it. In other words, something that's got a radio signal at the right frequency to activate it. So it can be used, and one of the issues where it would be really neat is inventory management. And so a lot of companies are doing that already. They're putting RFID tags on stuff. Ideally, if we could get the cost down cheap enough, and we're getting closer and closer, every piece of food and clothing and items you buy at something like Walmart would have an RFID tag on it. They'd all be serial numbered, and the minute you rolled up to the checkout clerk, that checkout scanner would scan every item in your cart and say, oh, right, here's your total. And it would take you, essentially 0 time except for the time to put in your card. That part's good. Some people have actually had those RFID chips, much like on a cat or a dog, put into various parts of their body, usually on their wrist or their top of their arm. That's the way they get into work. They scan it just like you would scan some of those cards to get in the contactless cards. That seems to get people very excited when we do that, or the thought of that, but they're not going to do that. Some employers have actually said, this is the only way you're going to get into our top secret security data clearance room, or you can do this, or you can stand there and scan in every day. And so employees have actually said, yeah, I'll do that. I don't know. It is not probably as horrible as what some of the news stations make it out to be, but it's probably not something I would do right away anyway. So they're a great tool. Most of the time it's passive. If they're an active RFID system, they've got to have room for a battery, so they're much, much larger. I think at some point we'll see them in more devices, more things. NFC. NFC is kind of similar to RFID in a weird way. So sometimes they have batteries, so you can think of it in some ways as an active system. Most of your phones now have NFC. In other words, I can conduct a small signal out within 8 or 10 inches is generally the limit. I go into not that I can right now, but say I'd go into McDonald's, or you could. And you go, man, I'd like to pay for that with my phone. And it uses contactless Apple Pay. That is using that near-field communications. It's designed for very, very short range. Very, very short range. It's passive in the most part. So we use these as another way to send data. Much shorter range even than RFID. So things like little buttons to get into a building where you just swipe it by. Maybe you've been to a hotel where instead of having to swipe your card, you just laid it on the door handle. That's something like an NFC. The other way that you can do that, so with Marriott especially, we've ran into a lot of places where with the Marriott app, we can actually open our hotel room door. We don't have to physically check in with anybody. We check in on the phone, and the NFC on our phone will actually open up the door. Works pretty slick, except for the few times it doesn't. But we've actually had really good luck with it, and it's kind of a handy thing. This is a newer idea, and it's really kind of fallen out of favor. I haven't seen a whole lot about it yet. And it was the idea that we were going to call it wireless USB. So it'd be just the same as if you plugged in wireless or USB. That term hasn't stayed around. However, Logitech uses the same technology, this what we used to call the wireless USB. They call it now a unifying receiver and unifying signal. And it is kind of handy because I can use one receiver and I can run almost any kind of wireless device from Logitech off of it. But can I run somebody else's wireless off of it? Not usually. So it was an idea. I think we may see it again because everybody knows what USB is. Although we've actually mucked that up a little bit with USB-C where it's made it confusing. But Most people know what USB is. It's kind of ubiquitous. Every device has one. We can plug into it. Pretty easy to do. And then we have one that's based on light, so infrared, so IR signals. So when you use your remote at your house and you point it at the TV, you have to have it pointed at the TV. You can't have it in the other room. Most of the time it's an IR signal. So we can't see it, but there's an eye on the TV that'll get it. So all of our remotes here are that way. So it can also do things like on my watch, it reads my heart rate through an IR sensor. So we're using them to look at blood sugar levels through scan. So you could look at like a tank of water or something and see where its level is with IR sensors. So they have a lot of other uses, but you can also send data with it. So there's an example of a remote. You guys have all seen that. But we can send data with an IR signal also. It tends to be not a very fast data signal. But if you go back even 5 or 6 or 7 years, a lot of laptops actually had an IR receiver and sender on them. And you could do that. It used to be some phones. The Samsung, some of the older Samsung phones had an IR sender and receiver. What was really cool is you could then use it as a remote for your entire television and stereo and everything else. It doesn't show up as much, but it is certainly a way that we can send and receive data. And it's got some industrial uses, because it can also then work as a sensor. So the other one that you don't see in here is something we call a free space optic. So our book doesn't talk a lot about free space optics. So we know that a laser, like your laser pointer, can transmit a long ways. It's essentially creating that laser from one point to another. So from this roof to the roof of the admin building and the receiver. And we can send a tremendous amount of data over short ranges. Now, because it's not constrained like it is in a fiber optic cable, it's got some limited range. That if you take your laser pointers and you shine them like 500 feet away in the dark, it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's the problem. It starts to lose signal and do that. But within a couple hundred meters, there are some free space optics that you can get 10 to 20 gigabits of data across. So it's actually a useful thing. Our book doesn't talk about that, so it's just another piece that's in there. All right, here's where it gets strange. We got to put a lot of numbers and try to keep everybody's brain moving. So this wireless works at levels 1 or 2. So it's the same as our wireless cards or our network cards. It really is a way that we send data back and forth. It's just the medium is not a wire or a fiber optic cable. We're sending it in some other means. So there are a lot of this IEEE's 802 standards. It's a little screwy because they don't necessarily follow in order like you would think. Because actually, B came before A. There's 11G, 11N, 802.11ac. There are now some new ones, and one of the things that we have tried to do is industry has said, man, that's confusing for the average person. Let's call it Wi-Fi 6. Okay, and so then when the next standard comes out, maybe we'll call it Wi-Fi 7. And so what we're trying to do is make it a little easier for the average consumer to identify what access point or what wireless they need for their house. Here's where it gets a little confusing. So, and it really started with this generation, 802.11n. So 802.11n said, oh, well, you can send data, and a fully implemented version 11n used a dual band radio. In other words, it transmitted at 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. But the manufacturer said, ooh, but if we call it N and it's only on 2.4, who's going to know? And so we started with this idea of, yeah, it's sort of N. So you really need to read the boxes and read the information about it before you do that. And so now we're having some similar things with the 802.11ac standard that's out. that some manufacturers don't quite follow the letter of that. It works, but it's not implementing all of the aspects of 802.11ac. So it really does take some looking and some checking and trying to figure out what's happening to get there. So this list is not current. So there are actually things past this, but if we just limit ourselves to this, notice the frequency band. So originally we always used 2.4 or, notice here 511N, or 5 gigahertz. 2.4 happens to be about the same frequency that a water molecule resonates. And that's the reason your microwaves at home work, is it resonates that frequency of a water molecule, and it makes the water molecule get energy and it bounces around. A lot of older networks, if you had a microwave that had a door seal bad and you ran the microwave, your Wi-Fi networks drops off. Pretty useful when you do that. You go, well, maybe I should buy a new microwave because my Wi-Fi network drops. The distance and the speed, so here's where we lie a lot. So let's say we're looking at 802.11ac, the first version, 3 data streams. It says, oh, I can do 1.3 gigabits per second. If they're that far apart. All other conditions are great, and we cheat a little bit. And the other piece of that is that's raw data. That's not usable data, that's raw data. And we'll talk about some of the overhead that's in there. So the other thing that starts to look interesting is, notice the speed. So it says we can do 1.3, but I can only do 1 gigahertz on most typical gigahertz cables. So the original AC models actually took 2 network drops to them. And so that slowed this adoption down because we've already got all the infrastructure in place with 1 network drop for your wireless access point. So now you got to go crawl through the ceiling and add a second drop. So it's been kind of an issue in terms of adoption. And the range is also kind of an interesting thing. So they kind of universally say, oh, well, inside it's about 70 meters and outdoors 250 meters. So 70 meters, longer than this building. Why do we have to have multiple access points in this building then? Again, I can see the signal at that end, but remember your device you're connecting from is trying to conserve battery and doesn't usually have a receiver that can transmit as far back as what you can receive. So there's some limitations on that. But if we could maybe possibly at some point really get that, and you could get almost 7 gigs per second to your laptop, wouldn't that be great? Well, except for a couple problems. Wireless devices, so remember on our wired devices, we said they were most of the time duplex. In other words, they could send and they could receive at the same time. They were full duplex. Wireless devices cannot. They can either send or they can receive. So automatically, we can almost think about, hey, we've cut the true throughput down by half. Because I can't send data and receive it at the same time. Because they're not contained in any kind of a hard shell or a tube or a wire, we can't prevent any kind of collision. So those little data packets are going to collect and run into each other. So we have to add some overhead. And this is a mouthful. Carrier sense, multiple access with collision avoidance. Ugh. So our wireless has to do this. It doesn't know how to send signals out. And so one of the things it does to minimize those collisions is everything that we send out has an acknowledgement packet. And it comes back and says, yep, I got that. Yep, I got that. So this is one of the reasons that theoretical output is far higher, because when they counted that and said, how many bits per second are you sending? Well, all those checksums, the acknowledgement packets and everything are included in that. Got it. Well, that makes sense. So they also will use this idea of request to send, clear to send. So we also send out a packet that says, hey, I want to send something. Can you send me a request to do that? So now we're adding more overhead to this. So we can only send one direction at a time. We have to say, hey, I'm going to send something, and we know there's still going to be collisions, and so every packet I send has to get a reception back and say, yep, I got your packet. So there's a lot of retransmissions in Wi-Fi. Well, now we're down a couple of things. And probably one of the other piece in there that we have to realize is that Wi-Fi signal isn't exclusive to whatever channel you're on. In other words, I'm sending and receiving, but rarely do you have one receiver and one client. So if I have 10 clients on there, they're all competing for that bandwidth. And then I get into an apartment complex, and there's 40 people in there, all with their own Wi-Fi, and there's not enough channels. In fact, on the older version of 2.4 gigahertz, so if you have an older one with 2.4, there's only really 3 channels. And you're all competing for that same space, and it gets slower and slower and slower. So, hence my idea that we will probably never replace entirely Wi-Fi or wired by Wi-Fi. So a lot of pieces going on that Wi-Fi signal. So it's not as clean. In other words, there's a lot of extra overhead. We know it's a shared medium. We're all sharing the same pool. And then we have other pieces that wireless is doing. Oh my goodness. So we have scanning. So scanning says, hey, I'm looking around my neighborhood and I'm trying to find those access points. So I can do 2 kinds of scanning. I can do what we call passive. In other words, I just look and see what people are broadcasting. Or I can do an active scan or a beacon, and I can send it out and I can say, or a probe, and I can say, hey, who's out there got Wi-Fi? And then my access points all will go, yep, here's a beacon back. So there's a lot of overhead pieces on this Wi-Fi. The fact it works as well as it does is actually pretty amazing, quite frankly. So some of the things we need to know about Wi-Fi. When I set up Wi-Fi, and I set up mine at my house, I got to choose a name that people can see, that SSID, Service Set Identifier. And so I can set it to anything. I like FBI van or something usually, or something weird. So that's how we can identify it. It's unique. And when I send a beacon out, hey, I get that information. So it does a couple of things for me. It makes it easier to tell what mine is. I can group them together, and now I call it a BSS, Basic Service Set. So when we had our list here of 4 Wi-Fi points, they were all the same name. So the computer would look at it and go, all right, I see all of them that say CMIS Lab. Which one's the strongest signal? And I'm going to connect to that one at this particular point. So it's kind of a handy way we can do that. At our campus, you don't have to figure out which access point I'm closest to. You just know, hey, I'm going to go blue, and I'm going to connect to whichever one is strongest of that particular signal. We also sometimes call it this extended service set, and that allows us to roam from device to device. And so that idea of roaming is where we hit those bigger, more expensive access points that allow us to do that hands-off roaming where it will not lose signal between connection to connection. So a great example of that is if you've been in the hospital, maybe not for me this week, but you'll see them walk around with what they call COWs, computers on wheels, kind of a ubiquitous name they've come up with. And when they're going down the hallway, they don't have to stop and go, oh, I'm by this access point. It will automatically go from one access point to the other. You don't have to relog in to Go Blue when you're at the library because it's the same system between one and another. So, you don't see it, but when you're moving, that computer and that access point are now chatting back and forth going, oh, I'm losing that signal, let me grab this one. And again, we've got more and more additional overhead we've got to deal with. So that association, in other words, we link and log into it, then is one way. So here's one with a single BSS, and here's an idea of something like what we have on our campus here. Multiple access points, you can move seamlessly from one to the other and generally don't lose access or connection. So in a business, at your house, you probably need one access point. In a business where you need 400 or 500 access points, it gets a little more complicated and there's more going on behind the scenes. And so usually there's a controller that's actually monitoring and managing this. That's allowing you to make some of these decisions. It's monitoring who's connected where. All right, I got further than I intended. I think I'll stop here for today. Make sure you read the rest of the chapter, and we're going to figure out how these work, and we're going to go into some of these simulations. Online, there's a couple of assignments, some lab simulations. I took out the live lab this week. It seems we've had far too many students having issues with being able to connect to those live labs, so thank you, Cengage. So we'll just pull those out to make life easy for everybody. If you want to try them, you can certainly go into Cengage directly. So jump out of one of your assignments and you can go try it. But it won't go back into Blackboard and affect your grade. So, although at this point, none of the grades show up in Blackboard, so I have to move them over manually. Thank you, Cengage. But such is life, the way this week is gone and the rest of this week is gone. All right. I am assuming we'll be here Wednesday. I will caution everybody, I'm not sure how the whole dad deal is going, so we'll see. He's not, knock on wood, they're not calling me and saying, hey, he's not going to make it through the night like he did last week to you right after I got out of class. So if that happens, I appreciate it very much. If that happens or something happens and I have to be out of town or I'm not here, I will let you guys know on email. So just watch your email and your announcements for class if something weird comes up. I can't guarantee anything, so we will go from there. All right, guys, I will see you on Wednesday.